My guest this hour is Richard Bernstein. He is a former Time magazine and New York Times reporter. He was a foreign correspondent and cultural critic for the New York Times. And he recently wrote a piece for Real Clear Investigations entitled Almost Overnight, Standards of Colorblind Merit Tumble Across American Society. And I don't know his politics, but in our conversation and talking with him, he seemed pretty normative and centrist. He definitely is not some right-wing guy, but the article is pretty much pointing out how this quick move to put equity over equality is not really good. It is going to have a deleterious effect on standards and having the best be the best in certain roles. It happened too quickly, and there's a tremendous downside to it. We talk about this in our conversation, and I ask him, why is it a problem and what he sees being the result of it? And here's the first segment of our interview. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to have you on because you wrote this very interesting piece in Real Clear Investigations called Almost Overnight, Standards of Colorblind Merit Tumble Across American Society. And we'll get into, you use some very tremendous examples, because I think the heart of this, you need to explain the problem to people in a way they can understand it, and painting a picture with the examples are great. But before we get to that, I want to talk about this tumble. I want to talk about this, what these standards of colorblindness are and were, before we get to how they're changing and what they're shifting. So what are these standards that were normal across society up until now with these groups trying to change them?
Well, the standards emerged initially out of the civil rights movement, or the idea of the standards emerged out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where it was clear that Black people were left out and ignored and discriminated against. And the movement was for everybody to be given equal opportunity and to everybody to have the same chance. So, that produced the phrase colorblindness, which at the time was seen as a good thing. That people, as Martin Luther King said, were being judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Well, in many ways, that's worked. As President Obama said at his commencement speech at Howard, there's been a lot of progress over the last 50 years since Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. But evidently, we still have a long way to go. And a movement emerged or a current of opinion emerged saying that colorblindness was insufficient and that there needed to be special treatment of the underrepresented minorities, especially Blacks and Latinos. And that rather than be colorblind, we had to be very color aware in order to make sure that the old heritage of discrimination, the after effects of the years of slavery and Jim Crow and all that could be overcome. They weren't going to be overcome by treating everybody equally. They had to be overcome by a kind of positive discrimination. That's how the French used the French expression. I was once the Paris bureau chief of the New York Times, and I learned the French used the expression positive discrimination to describe what we call affirmative action. And, there's truth to that, and there's some reasonableness to that. But then it goes quite far, so that the idea of colorblindness now has become associated with the effort to maintain white supremacy. That so far from giving people an equal chance, it's seen now as a way of it's seen now as an artifact of systemic racism. And it requires, in a way, that rather than apply the same standards to everybody, that some other standard, that the standards depend on the race or ethnicity of the person involved.
Right. And obviously, it's a given that this has been accelerated by, COVID may have pushed it further too, but primarily the George Floyd murder. But that's not really where this started. Tell me what you think. I know I wrote a book 3 years ago called We Want Equality, how the fight for equality gave way to preference. So even then, I was already seeing this shift. And like you talked about the French phrase, I called it negative equality, right? Or we don't want equality, we want justified inequality, right? So I could see then that people were starting already down the road of saying, I won't go as far as necessarily equal outcomes. They haven't gotten there yet. I hear that a lot. I don't think they've gotten there yet. If what they want pushing for now doesn't work, then they'll go to equal outcome. What they're really saying is, like you said, use all of these other metrics besides equality to determine how we will address X. So if we say the number for this thing we're doing is 5, if the standard is 5, then maybe it should be 6 for a white guy, and maybe it should be 4 for a woman, and maybe it should be 3 for a black male, that kind of thing. And then let's see what happens, right? And then they'll get to the outcome later. So when did you see this really starting to take off?
I guess I saw it. I mean, it's, as you say, I think the first conspicuous example to me was how the idea of affirmative action was actually implemented, so that you had just what you've said. You had different standards or different test results for different groups. And it turns out that the Asian Americans seem to score highest on the standardized tests like the SAT. Whites come next, and then Blacks and Latinos. And so you have this big differential between the Blacks and Latinos on the one side and and especially the Asians, but the whites and the Asians on the other. And this is also the case with entry into elite high schools. We have in New York here, I live in New York, we have these so-called specialized high schools, Stuyvesant High School, most famous among them. And in 1971, the state legislature passed a law requiring that admissions to Stuyvesant be based solely on the results of an admissions test. And the paradox of this is that the state legislature was trying to eliminate the possibility of harmful discrimination, because up until then there was a lot of who you know kind of thing. People who were socially prominent, who had connections, could call up, make the right phone call, and they could get their kid into one of the specialized schools. And this clearly advantaged white people. And so the legislature, in order to overcome this form of discrimination, determined that only the test would allow admission. Then it turns out that for some reason that, frankly, I still don't understand, Blacks didn't do well on the test. They scored low on the test. And so, and even now, after 50 years, you have 1% and 2% Black students being admitted into Stuyvesant High School, and 70, I think the latest statistic I saw was 74% are Asian. So in order to overcome this, and this is a bad thing. I mean, I'm first to recognize that in a city like New York, which is, 1/3 Black, it's ridiculous that only 1% of the student body at a place like Stuyvesant is Black. Well, what to do about it? Is the right thing to do about it to lower the standard of the test? Or is the right thing to do about it to pay attention to making sure that Black kids get preparation for the test so that they can do better on it? I'm in favor of the latter, because I think it's important for the society that we have these kinds of elite high schools. I mean, Stuyvesant, among Stuyvesant High School, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech, the 3 specialized high schools, there's something like 20 Nobel Prizes among the graduates of those schools. We need to maintain that tradition, even as we make the schools more diverse. But I don't think that the way to make the schools more diverse is to lower the standard.
Coming up, more with Richard Bernstein, former Time Magazine and New York Times reporter. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Richard Bernstein. We're talking about the merits of color blindness. And we were just speaking on selective enrollment schools in New York. And he was trying to figure out the best way to get more Black students. But I asked him here if lowering the standards not only cheats some people out of getting in, but it weakens the school, making the schools go from great to just good. He talked about how there were so many Nobel Prize winners from those schools. And I asked simply, would that continue if we lower the standards overall?
Well, I think that's you put your finger on it. I mean, I think that's the danger, that you'll end up with a group of students that know that they were let in under a different standard, that feel insecure, that are unhappy. And one or two things is going to happen. Either the school is going to change to accommodate those kids, or those kids aren't going to do well. And either way, the quality of the school is probably going to, the Nobel Prize producing quality of the school is going to go down. There are other elements in the picture specifically about specialized schools in New York, which is that I know Black parents in New York because I have a son actually who went to Stuyvesant High School, and before that he was in a private middle school, and there were plenty of Black families in the middle school who were, whose kids were, totally up to the level. And I spoke to the parents about that, and some of them said that they don't want to send their kids to Stuyvesant. They don't even want them to take the test, because they don't want them to be, the only Black kids in the school. I think that there's an element of self-selection, in other words, involved. And, because one thing that's ignored by the woke forces is that the liberal institutions of society, the educational establishment, the universities, the media, are trying their best to open the doors to, the previously underrepresented. And what that means is that a lot of the elite private schools are taking, the high-performing Black kids are being swept up into the private schools with scholarships, and if they have financial need. They're not even taking a test for schools like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science. It doesn't mean that the society isn't doing something. It just means that the high-performing Black and Latino kids are going elsewhere. I mean, there's a program in New York called Prep for Prep. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but they take, I think the number is 200 high-performing Black students in the public schools in the 8th grade, and they offer them special programs in order to improve their academic performance. And then they channel them into private boarding schools and private day schools. So you have these 200 kids who are not going to take the test at Stuyvesant, but they're going to, Andover and Choate, and they're going to the, Collegiate and Dalton and the most prestigious private schools in the Northeast. I always thought, why are they channeling these kids into the private schools? Why don't they encourage them to take the test for the specialized schools? And that all by itself would bring 200 more kids into the system, and it would help to redress the racial imbalance, at least somewhat.
Yeah, but who knows if it would even make a difference, because it's the same 200 kids. All 200 went to Stuyvesant, for instance. Yes, that group could find the next 200 high-performing kids and do the same thing, but they already took the top 200 performance schools, so it's the second-tier 200 really prepared for the others, or would they be willing to do it? So it's that whole cyclical thing. I mean, you just need more raw material, as it were. But your point is well taken, that there are organizations and groups and people out there doing things actively to try to help, but there needs to be two sides to it. So the other side needs to do something too, whether it's Blacks self-selecting, or whether it's Blacks not wanting to leave their community, or not having the rigor to be high enough to be pulled into that 200, because they were skimming off the top, right? So, So you still got the 200 that just missed that cut, that aren't taking the test of Stuyvesant or getting that extra private school prep. So we need to find a way to increase this skill set of the masses, is what I always say. But the problem is it won't happen because we're not focused on it. It's not like we can't do it. It's not like the kids aren't smart enough to do it. It's not like there's enough people. It's racism. It's not like there's not enough Black and white people out there willing to do it. We're just too busy focusing on other things, saying it's the white man and it's racist and it's this, instead of focusing on the root of the problem, which gets back to your article. So we talked about what these colorblind merits were, and I want you to give us some of these great examples you write about of the types of things they're doing to, quote unquote, correct the problem.
Yeah. I mean, one of the examples was the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association put out a strategic plan for equity in the field of medicine. And it calls for all kinds of things, notably introducing critical race theory into medical education. You know, I spent years of my life as a journalist in China, and I was always aware that the Chinese education system requires students to do political study. They have to study the virtues of the Chinese Communist Party and what a wonderful organization it is, and how how everybody should believe in it and support it. And I thought, I think to introduce critical race studies into medical education is a little bit comparable to that. It's paying attention to the ideology of the students and taking away time from actual medical training. They'd also, I interviewed via email. I submitted questions and got answers to the incoming president of the American Medical Association, asking him what about medical school admissions? And, the answer is we have to recruit more Black students into medical school. But the medical schools have been trying their best to recruit Black students into medical schools for decades. And as it is right now, the scores on the main test for medical students, the average Black student getting admitted into medical school is at the 69 percentile on the MCAT, the medical test, and the white and Asians are at 89 in the 89th percentile. So unless there's this pool, you were talking about the pool, unless there's a pool of would-be medical school applicants that are not applying to medical school, and that somehow the AMA can discover this pool, what does it mean to recruit more Black kids Black students into medical school? It means that the percentile would be even lower. And I think when you talk about and then it's become very fashionable, especially in the wake of the George Floyd incident, to address your question directly, for corporate America to create a diversity and equity office. And the Diversity and Equity Office then makes a plan to recruit more underrepresented minorities and women. And so, for example, Hewlett-Packard now has a plan so that 50% of its senior management people will be women or minorities by the year 2030. That the number of Black engineers and technicians will be at or above it was a little bit mysterious what they said here, at or above their proportion in the labor force. So now about 5% of working engineers in the country now are Black, but their proportion of the population is roughly 12.5%. HP doesn't say how is it going to find how in the next 9 years is it going to raise the level to 12.5%. I wish them luck. I hope that it can happen. But what will it do to standards? Are they going to recruit people just to make their numbers? I think there's a lot of that. That in order to be politically correct, in order to be deemed to be socially responsive, specifically, to have responded to the George Floyd incident, that you have a lot of organizations that are just making their numbers. But are the roles that the people who are helping them to make the numbers, are they really significant roles? Under what standards are they being accepted? To what extent is this just sort of a PR show? And to what extent is it meaningful change? I'm a little bit skeptical about all of that.
Coming up, more with Richard Bernstein, former Time Magazine and New York Times reporter. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with former Time Magazine and New York Times reporter Richard Bernstein. We're continuing trying to solve the problem of how we expand equality without creating an aggressive set-aside that's unfair to the people who play by the rules and that lowers the standards and the production of things on the back end because you don't have the best of the best in those positions. We talk about United Airlines mandating that 50% of their pilots in the school would be minorities. And I asked the question, what happens if women don't want to be pilots? You don't get enough in the beginning. So I talk about raw materials, and I reference an analogy I use in my book called the guacamole problem. So one of the, it works for women too, but I talk about it a lot about hiring blacks or putting blacks in certain positions. I have an analogy that I use regularly. It's called the guacamole analogy. And so my point is, let's say the government's coming up and this is what they're doing. Biden came in and he signed these executive orders. He said, we have a guacamole problem and we think it's important that guacamole needs to be everywhere. And as a government official, we're going to force it. We're going to force you to make guacamole. We're going to force you to sell guacamole. You must carry guacamole on your shelves. Everybody must get guacamole, right? So we all focus on guacamole, but we never pay attention to the supply of avocados. So we find that we don't have enough avocados to make the guacamole, and then we're in the same position we're in all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think the pipeline issue is a very important one, and I love the guacamole. As a lover of guacamole, I'm concerned about the supply of avocados. There's also, by the way, the United Airlines was 50% of the class in their flight school would be women and minorities,
right?
Not just women. So that they have 5,000 students in the flight school. So 2,500 of them will, by 2030, need to be women and minorities.
Who are they eliminating? What if these great people who flew in the Air Force want to be pilots when they come out of the Air Force? Now they don't have a shot because there's not enough seats.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's another element to it. It gets us back to the specialized schools in New York. That the Asians do very well, and I admire them for it. They were told, these are the rules. This is what you have to do. You have to perform well on the test, and they take the steps. They do the work in order to perform well on the test. And now all of a sudden they're told, no, it's not fair. This is not fair because you're overrepresented in the specialized high school. So some of you, even though you performed well and you succeeded, you did what you were told, are not going to be in the school anymore. And, so then the response to that by the mayor and the chancellor of education was, well, these are people who can afford expensive test prep. But the fact is that 50% of the students at Stuyvesant, the 74% that are Asian, are qualify for free lunch. So their families are qualified for one form or another of public assistance.
So what I keep screaming out constantly is, even if I agree with you on what you want to change, why aren't you, if you want more minorities to be in this industry, why aren't you introducing them to that as opposed to going to the back end and yelling at GE and saying, show me how many black engineers you have? But you did nothing in the formative years to get people interested. So they have to know this stuff will not work.
Well, I think, and I feel this myself, in a funny way, I don't really want to be taking the public position that I find myself taking sometimes on these issues because I'm not black. And I support the idea of improvement in our, I think that for the social peace, for the workings of our country, we have to find ways to redress the imbalances of the past. I totally support that. And it's hard for me as a white person to sometimes appear to be unsympathetic to these aspirations. I'm not unsympathetic to the aspirations. I believe in the aspirations. It's just a question of how do we achieve them? I think that there's a lot of virtue signaling. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of people who are paying lip service to the idea, but as you put it, in a kind of meaningless way. And I think that, the classical music critic proposing this at the New York Times was a perfect example of that. I had a kind of perverse thought about that, which is that, well, if you really want to do something about the representation of blacks in classical music, the New York Times has never had a black classical music critic. So why don't you step down and have some black, classical music expert take your place? And his response would be, well, but I'm really a terrific classical music critic.
And that white guy is a really terrific bassoonist.
Right. I'm the best classical music critic there is. So that's why I'm here at the New York Times as the classical music critic. If I gave away my seat to somebody for, because of the color of his skin, we would be lowering the standards. That's what his response would be. But when it comes to hiring people for the orchestra, it's okay. It's just not okay for his job.
Coming up, more with Richard Bernstein. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Richard Bernstein, former Time Magazine and New York Times reporter. In this segment, I ask him something somewhat controversial. Aren't we wasting our time with this effort to fix racism and to change human nature? Human nature is flawed. You can't fix it. It takes great hubris to think you can. And so I asked Richard, if we somehow snapped our fingers and we were all the same skin color, wouldn't people just find other ways to separate into groups and discriminate against each other?
Yeah, I think we would. I mean, it's a peculiarity of American culture that because we are, in fact, I think the most successful, large, multicultural and multiracial experiment in human history. I mean, and in fact, if you want to look at this from a different point of view, I mean, I know that we have terrible flaws and that there's discrimination and that there are differences among the groups. But, by and large, certainly for the last 50 or 60 years, I think, we've not done that badly as a multiracial society that's made an effort to improve things for the groups that were left out or that were discriminated against in the past. Other societies that don't have racial differences find other ways of discriminating. That's absolutely true. In fact, a little fact that I seized on just watching a movie about Norway and the king's reaction to the Nazi invasion of Norway in World War II. And I found out that the biggest holiday in Norway celebrates the day that they achieved their independence from whom? From Denmark. So, we tend to think, that all of the Scandinavians are kind of alike. They're all white. They're blonde. They have blue eyes. They speak, Scandinavian languages. They're socially progressive. They're wonderful. But why are there three separate Scandinavian countries, 4 of them, if you include Finland. It's because within the Scandinavians, they find differences and they find ways to quarrel with each other and to find themselves, wanting to create
right.
Their own
the United Kingdom is only somewhat united.
Right, yes. And in some respects, less and less united. I live in Brooklyn, New York, with more multiracial and multicultural than Brooklyn, New York. I don't think you could find any place in the world. And yes, from time to time, there are tensions. But, by and large, you ride the subway, you walk the streets. You see all these different people. We seem to be getting along fairly well. That doesn't mean that there isn't work to be done, but I think it bothers me.
But my point is they get along for the most part, of course, but you still have people saying, well, yeah, they live over there. Those are the people who have this income, or those are the people who worship that religion. I'm not attacking them, but I do have a different view of them. So even if they get what they want and they erase we're colorblind and we don't see race, we would find a way to separate ourselves.
Yeah.
So maybe my point is maybe that's not the goal to fix. To stop trying to spend so much energy and effort on seeing what people think of each other.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another characteristic of our society right now, and it comes from the intensity of feeling on this issue, is that we tend to always put the worst possible interpretation on things. So somebody makes a comment that somebody finds a little bit wrong or a little bit offensive, and they dial up the degree of offense when, in fact, no offense was really meant. You have a good example of that at my former employer, the New York Times. I don't know if you followed the Don McNeil story, this report. He'd been at the paper for 46 years. I know him. He's a white guy. And by the way, when you talk about people saying stuff about, when they're by themselves, I'm over 70 years old. I have never in my life, heard anybody use the N-word, for example, in a derogatory way, or speak in some kind of racist or derogatory way about Black people, even if the nearest Black person was miles away. That's just kind of the culture that people like me and people like you live in. We frown on discrimination. We frown on racism. We don't like it. Mm-hmm. So this guy, Don McNeil, he was the leader of the Times representative on a high school trip that was in Peru over the summer. And a girl asked him a question about there was in her school some years before, there had been a dispute between a white girl and a Black girl, and the white girl used the N-word. So McNeil was asked, did he think that this girl should be expelled? And he wanted a little context. And so he used the N-word in that context to say, well, did she say that word as an insult, or was it in some other context? So it got back to parents that he had used the word. The parents complained to the New York Times. There was an investigation, and it was found that it was indiscreet of him to have used the word even in that context, but that there was nothing malicious or hostile about it, and that no disciplinary action was required. 2 years later, the Daily Beast, the news website, reports on this incident. And all of a sudden, there are cries from within the staff of the New York Times for him to apologize. He didn't feel that he had anything to apologize for. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. And the pressure mounted and the pressure mounted. And eventually, after a few days, he was forced out of the paper after, 46 years of being at the paper. So here's a perfect example of this urge to always apply the worst possible interpretation on things that are subject to many other interpretations. We're getting a little far afield from the question of standard, but there's a kind of moral fanaticism in the air that's making it harder for the groups, for our different constituent parts, to get together. And I wish that we would just all kind of cool it a little bit, recognize that there's a lot of goodwill on the part of all the groups, and that we shouldn't always be attributing evil motives to actions and statements that can be explained in other ways.
Coming up, my final segment with former Time Magazine and New York Times reporter Richard Bernstein. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've been discussing a recent article by Richard Bernstein, former Time magazine and New York Times reporter, about eliminating colorblind standards. And here's the final segment of our interview. So what do we do? Because this snowball is gaining momentum as it goes downhill.
What do we do? I mean, I wish that I were as good at coming up with solutions as I think I am at isolating the problem. But for one thing, revolutions don't happen when people are have hit the bottom. Revolutions happen when people have, rising expectations because things are actually getting better. I think one thing that we can do is recognize that racial equality, getting over discrimination, redressing the injustices of the past is something that the society generally agrees on. I mean, we have, talk about a different area, gays and lesbians. I mean, from people like Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama thinking that gay marriage was ridiculous, we now have gay marriage as the law of the land. There's been a tremendous change in that. Doesn't mean we're, a perfect society by any means, but we're not doing so badly. And maybe a little bit of recognition of that fact would help to bring us together. Another thing we have, that you were talking about before, which is that we have to be looking upstream. We have to be looking more at 5-year-olds than at 25-year-old would-be classical musicians. Mm-hmm. That's where the real problem is in New York. It's the low quality of the public schools. And we're in the middle of a beginning of a mayoral election here, and everybody is talking about how we're going to improve the schools. But does anybody actually really do it? I don't know how to improve the schools, but I certainly know that that's a key to it, that we have to have more qualified people coming into the pipeline. The schools are very segregated racially. I mean, part of that is what you were saying about groups groups naturally kind of congregate. You have a bunch of Jews here and you have blacks over there and you have evangelical Christians in another place. And just sort of naturally, if, they're going to kind of group together. So some of the segregation is due to this kind of natural grouping of people in neighborhoods. But it would be ridiculous to say that it also doesn't have something to do with poverty, that you end up with the minorities in lower rent districts. Mm-hmm. And so their schools are not as good. The good teachers don't want to teach in those schools because they don't feel safe. But, some way has to be found to improve the quality of the schools. And I think if we did that, we would be a long way to redressing the injustices that that kind of the residue of racism and discrimination from the past.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you always have to catch them young to solve the problem. Unfortunately, I think we're going to get a little worse before we get better. And I think the city solution, all those people running for mayor, is to focus on none of the things that we're talking about and all the things in your article as the solution to the problem. So we have a ways to go. But I thank you for your time. He is Richard Bernstein, former Time magazine and New York Times reporter, and wrote the great article for Real Clear Investigations. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.